session that is supposed to begin at 5:30. We're still having some technical difficulties. I know that you all are aware that we've had some IT issues last couple of days. We're trying to get Councilmember Hall signed in. Pardon? I'm sorry, Councilmember Hall, you're right there. Councilmember Wilsey is having trouble signing in. I apologize. So I would like to go ahead and get started because we're on a time constraint this evening. We've got a hard stop at 6:45. So, and I know this was a topic that is going to take our full attention for a little over an hour. And so if we hopefully, Councilmember will be able to tune in soon. But thank you again. And this is a work session on the discussion of occupation tax profitability tables. And Mr. Luckett, Councilmember Wilsey, I'm glad we got you. Councilmember Luckett, if you would start your presentation, I'd appreciate it.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. As the Mayor mentioned, I'm here this evening to talk about our occupation tax and how the profitability tables that factor into that, how those work, and how we handle those as we administer the occupation tax process. The agenda for this presentation, first I'm going to kind of give you an overview of occupation tax and how it works, what the purpose is of those profitability tables, give you a history of the adjustments that have occurred since we've had the gross receipts tax or the occupation tax in place, and then also look at some potential next steps as we move forward. So the occupation tax is a tax that is enacted by a local government for the purpose of raising revenue. This tax itself is authorized by state law. It was last updated and authorized by the General Assembly in 1993, and it's had one or two updates since then. The occupation tax is levied on businesses and practitioners that have an office or location within the city. Once a business pays their occupation tax each year, the city then provides an occupation tax certificate to that business, which simply means that they have paid their occupation tax. The traditional kind of name for this in the past has been known as business license, and that's probably how most people recognize that. And we use it interchangeably a lot because that is what a lot of people understand. But for the purposes of this presentation and technically in state law, it is referred to as occupation tax. Also, just wanted to point out, state law does provide multiple methodologies for a local government to use. You can use one or more methodologies in levying the occupation tax. And I'll get into more of sort of a history about how we went about that here at the city. So back in November of 2016, I'm sorry, I'm not sharing my presentation, am I? I apologize for that. Can everyone see that? Okay. Let me go back to So this was my previous slide. So just wanted to kind of, as I've talked through all these points, but just did want to point out some of those aspects of the occupation tax and how that works. So in terms of background, in November of 2016, the mayor and council at the time did approve changing methodologies. Previously, the city had assessed occupation tax based on a per employee fee. And that decision was made to shift to a gross receipts method in combination with profitability. That effective date of that law going into effect was January 1st of 2018. So that was the first year that we implemented the gross receipts methodology. So just to give you a brief overview of how the process itself works, and all this is kind of outlined in state law. So businesses are classified into groups, and we use the North American Industry Classification System, otherwise referred to as NAICS codes. And so as you can see, a NAICS code itself can go all the way to 6 digits, and it can be very specific in terms of the type of business that it's referencing. So for this instance, this 6-digit code is specifically for florists. You can also kind of go to a higher level classification based on the first 2 digits of the NAICS code. In this case, a 45. That the name of that category is a wholesale and retail trade. So we classify those businesses into these subgroups. And then we use data from the Internal Revenue Service to calculate profitability ratio. And profitability ratio is calculated for each NAICS code. That's basically, we are able to obtain profitability information on this level of NAICS classification. It doesn't really, we're not able to access data that goes all the way down to this level of detail. So the profitability ratio is calculated for each NAICS code by dividing that net income provided by the IRS by the gross receipts. Next, we take each NAICS code, and those NAICS codes are ranked based upon the profitability ratio, and tax rates are assigned or established. One of the key points in state law is that the tax rates must coincide with increasing profitability. So in other words, we could not tax a lower profit business higher than a higher profit business. It has to kind of go in lockstep. And then finally, occupation tax is calculated by multiplying the gross receipts that are reported by a business less any deductions or exemptions. In state law, in our ordinance also outlines what those deductions are, and the exemption amount is something that is also set by council. So that's the gross receipts are multiplied by the tax rate to determine the actual occupation tax amount that's due. Now getting into the IRS profitability tables. So state law directs that profitability is calculated by using nationwide averages. This is a quote from state law. Nationwide averages from statistics, classifications, or other information published by the United States Office of Management and Budget, the IRS, or successor agencies. Now typically, based on my experience and what I've seen in neighboring communities, local governments do use the IRS statistics to calculate profitability. However, I just want to point out a few things about how that works. One is that really state law doesn't really provide clear guidance on which IRS statistics to use. And so what you see is a lot of variation among local governments in terms of which actual table they use and even which year they utilize. And as you'll see in a few moments, the IRS isn't updating this information, or at least they're not providing the information publicly on an annual basis. So, the data, the most recent data that may be available, might be 4, 5, 6 years old, depending upon the actual table that we're talking about. The other thing that can vary is the frequency of updating profitability. That varies by government and the actual available IRS data and how often they update that. So, in my conversations with some of our neighboring cities, they are on varying schedules, and some of our neighboring cities that are newer cities haven't actually updated their statistics since they were initially incorporated and they set up their ordinance and their occupation tax itself. So when it comes to profitability tables in the city of Roswell, so as part of the initial setup back in 2016, the mayor and council did adopt a resolution. This was separate from our ordinance that established profitability thresholds and the accompanying tax rate. So you can see here that the council established the ranges of profitability and along with that, what tax rate goes with each one. There was no specifying really, what NAICS code falls within each profitability. And so under this structure, as profitability changes, a business may move among those established tax rates. And that's kind of how this particular methodology is set up. So I wanted to get into kind of a history of, a short history, because this began in FY 2018, but the history of the adjustments that have been made since then, and kind of the thinking behind that. So with the initial ordinance adoption back in 2016, and of course, that didn't go into effect until our 2018 renewal process, the data source that was used at the time were the IRS statistics of income, and specifically the table was all business types. And the date or the year of the data came from 2008. As we move forward and moving into subsequent years, in preparation for the 2019 renewal process, staff did review available data sources to see if more recent data was available. And we did find that recent data. It was a different table. It was still IRS statistics of income, but as you can see here, instead of all business types, the table that was utilized was active corporations, which is really a subset of this table here. And you can see we were able, the most recent data that we could find at the time was from 2013. And I will say that was probably the biggest driving factor in the decision to update our tables at that time, was the concern over the time period of data that was available that had been used in 2018 and as part of the initial process. Our concern was trying to find the most recent data available so that we were using recent information. This information source, this data source, was used also for the 2020 renewal process. And both data sources, from what I've found, and probably others as well, are used by various local governments. So from my research and talking to some of our neighboring cities, I found that cities like Dunwoody, City of Johns Creek, they use the active corporations as their data source for determining profitabilities. Spoke with Sandy Springs and Milton. They weren't able to give me the exact source that they had used, and I think that's probably because it's been a while since they've updated it. And I know in speaking with Councilmember Hall, she had pointed out that she had found out that the City of Canton, they use the all business types data source when determining their profitability. Also wanted to point out, just for provide some additional context and background, some other changes that were approved by council for the 2019 renewal process. So as you might remember, we made it through that first year of the gross receipts methodology. We came back to council and reported on the data that we had collected at a high level, but also reported on just some things that we noticed, things that we thought could be improved upon, some potential changes that we were recommending. So just to give you an idea of some of those changes that occurred at the time when this was initially enacted, council had included, and it's kind of a long story, and I'll be glad to share that with you if it's needed. But under the initial implementation, there was a cap on the total amount of occupation tax that a home business would pay. So in 2019, that cap was removed so that home businesses were treated the same as all commercial businesses. Another change that was made for the 2019 renewal process was that the exemption, the standard exemption that applied to all businesses, was increased from $50,000 to $100,000. At the time also, we did establish a per employee fee to go in conjunction with the gross receipts tax. And that per employee fee was $12 per employee. And it primarily applies to everyone, but the fee for businesses that have less than 100 employees is zero. So it's $12 per employee for businesses that have 100 employees or more. And then the last change that was made, last major change that was made, was that the application fee that we charge as a kind of an administrative fee, that was made to apply to all businesses, which before this, it didn't apply to home businesses. So there's just a few of the other changes that were made as part of the 2019 renewal process, and all those received council authorization at that time. So this gives you a comparison. So once we made that adjustment from one tax table to another, this table kind of gives you a comparison of what those profitability ratios were and how they changed from the initial 2018 year to the 2019 and 2020 renewal seasons. So as you can see, they did change quite a bit. Some of them not so much, but others were a little more dramatic, especially when you see, for instance, finance and insurance, real estate, rental and leasing, management of companies or holding companies. Those were some major changes. And then when you look at the actual tax rate, so once those new profitability ratios were calculated, obviously the businesses shifted between the tax rates that were established at the time. A lot of our gross receipts, in terms of which NAICS code they come from, about 65% of our total gross receipts actually didn't change in terms of the tax rate. And that's primarily what you see here in the wholesale and retail trade. We have a lot of new car dealerships that they fall in this. You can see their tax rate remained the same from one to another. But we do have a lot of businesses that fall into the professional, scientific, and technical service classification. They decreased quite a bit, as did some of the businesses that were in that higher tax rate. The real estate went from a 12.12% to half of that, to a 0.06%. So that kind of gives you some background on how we got to where we are, and I have some information just to share with you on some potential next steps. So in terms of recommendations, there is more recent IRS data available at this point, and our recommendation would be to move to the most recent data, and that would involve moving back to the previous table that was used in 2018. So that would be moving from the active corporations data to the all business types data. And it would be my recommendation that we would move back to that table and maintain that table permanently, because I do think it does reflect, it is more reflective of all business types in all businesses that exist in Roswell. With that change in profitability and using that new updated table, so I provided here what those updated profitabilities would look like. And as you can see, those profitabilities are more in line with the profitabilities that existed back in 2018. Some of them are small increases from the most recent table. Some of the increases are more dramatic. As you can see, real estate going from 16 to 65, management of companies 19 to over 100%. In general, the 2021 profitability ratios are more in line with those 2018 numbers from before. When we translate that into tax rates, again, those tax rates that are, again, these are proposed tax rates, or if the tables are updated. So this change hasn't happened yet, but if that were to occur, you can see here that so The tax rates for 2021, again, are more reflective of the tax rates going back to 2018. And again, some of the changes aren't quite as much, but some of them are quite a bit. So I wanted to take that information and kind of boil that down to what it would look like and what the estimated impact would be on the business level. And so I use these examples that were in place from our June 9th presentation. These particular NAICS categories, as well as these business types, were chosen because they are more representative of the types of businesses that are here in Roswell. So this is not every NAICS classification. Obviously, it's not every business type, but it's representative of probably the vast majority of the overall businesses that we have in our database. So this is one change I just also wanted to point out too. There's one change in this slide from the original presentation that I sent out. I did go ahead and add in the 2018 tax amount, just based on some questions I'd received and some feedback. So I wanted to make sure that we were showing all of those years. But so basically what this shows you is that for a new car dealer, on average, gross receipts of 83 million, 100 employees. And so in 2018, the tax would have been $8,445. That tax amount actually went up with the 2019-2020 renewal process, mainly because this type of business would have paid that per employee fee. If we were to implement the updated profitability tables, that tax would go up to $17,930. And that's primarily because under the new profitability tables, this type of business not only did not go back to the original tax rate that they were assessed in 2018, because of their profitability ratio, they were actually pushed up into the next tax class. Just moving on here, I also want to show you too on this far right-hand section, just as a point of comparison, I did want to provide kind of how that would compare to our neighboring cities. So we looked at, and this is again from the presentation back on June 9th. So we looked at cities including Brookhaven, Dunwoody, Johns Creek, Milton, Peachtree Corners, and Sandy Springs. So these are all cities that have the gross receipts methodology. The one city that you don't see there, Alpharetta, today they're on a per employee fee for their occupation tax. So I did want to show you as well, comparatively, what is the lowest surrounding city to us, and how, even with these updated tables, how we would compare to those amounts. So just to kind of walk through a few more of these. So in this particular NAICS category, a plumbing HVAC contractor, average gross receipts of 3.6 million, paid $860 in 2018. That declined to $500 in 2019 and 2020. That would go up to $1,200 in 2021. A few other examples here for a restaurant, bringing in gross receipts of $1 million. They went from $340 to $330. That's primarily because they're one of the NAICS codes that didn't change. The profitabilities didn't change enough to push them into any other tax class. And so if these new tables were implemented based on the updated profitabilities, they would be pushed into an increased tax class, one tax class above where they are today, which explains the reason for this increase to $420. One of the other ones, so an apartment complex on average, average gross receipts of $3.1 million. They paid $3,810 in 2018. This was one of the ones that declined quite a bit, so it did drop to $1,950 in 2019 and 2020. But in 2021, under the new or proposed tax tables, that would go back to $3,750. I just wanted to go over a few of those with you and kind of illustrate what the overall impact would be. So finally, I just wanted to provide some options for your consideration and request some guidance on moving forward. So basically, I kind of boiled it down to three options. One being moving forward with updating our profitability ratios to the most recent data that's reflecting all business types and adjusting those tax rates accordingly. Number two and three are kind of similar in that obviously we're in some unusual and unique economic times. And obviously businesses have felt some effects from that. And so I wanted to acknowledge that and provide that as an option. So, the second option could be that we move forward with number one, along with some type of one-time assistance to take into account the economic effects of COVID-19. That one-time assistance could take a variety of forms. And state law allows the council to make those kinds of decisions. It could be in the form of an increased exemption, reduction in the tax amount. There's a variety of options there, and we could provide more information to you all if that's the direction the council would want to go. And then finally, number three would be to postpone the implementation of the updated profitability ratios to the following year. And again, just in consideration of the economic effects of COVID-19. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and I'll be glad to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Luckett. I just wanted to clarify something with you. Our ordinance states, section 10.3.12 states that the finance department shall review assignment of businesses to profitability classes on a biannual basis and administratively reassign businesses as necessary to then the most accurate profitability class. So my question for you is, has that been done on a biannual basis?
So we initially updated it in 2019. And so based on that, the 2021 renewal season would be the next time to make those updates.
Thank you. And then also let me ask you this question. If I believe that if we went with number three, so let's say that we decide this evening that we want to change the tax table. We also have the option of not only doing it in arrears, so you pay what your profitability was for the year before, and then the next year, if it comes in higher, you would owe that. But then also that would allow for us to remain revenue neutral on this. Is that correct?
So you're saying that if we did not change our tax tables, we would remain at revenue neutral?
No, I'm saying if we change our tax table, we still have the opportunity to remain revenue neutral.
Yes, there would be other means the council could enact to maintain the revenue neutral standpoint. Okay. Yes.
Great. And then also, I can't remember if it was a June 9th meeting or a different one, when you were talking about a budget shortfall of, was it $400,000, $500,000? Could you explain to me what that was about? Was it property taxes or was it occupational tax?
So at the June 9th committee meeting, we did present kind of the comparison of the 2019 budget and the 2019 actual revenue for occupation tax. And the variance there was about $540,000. The primary reason for that is, when we established the gross receipts methodology beginning in 2018, we had to use the best data we could find in terms of developing a revenue projection. And so at the time, we used national averages when it comes to the negative classification for that type of business. So we did know the business types that we had in Roswell, but we had never collected any information in terms of gross receipts. So we use those national averages as our means of developing a revenue projection. And as we got into that first year, actual gross receipts from, specific Roswell businesses came in less than those national averages that we used. The unfortunate part in terms of the timing of it all, so the 2018 renewal process started in January of 2018. And because of the timing of it, we were also developing our budget for 2019 at that point, our revenue projections at that point. So we didn't even have, a year's worth of data to be able to update the next year at that time. And so we stayed at the same revenue projection that we did in 2019 as we had in 2018. And that explains the variance, the negative variance, because we were still basing our revenue projection off that initial projection because we didn't have really good data at the point that we were developing our revenues as part of the upcoming budget process.
Thank you, Mr. Luckett. Does council have any questions? Councilmember Tizer.
Thank you, Mayor Ryan. Could you flip up to the chart on page 15 for just a moment?
Sure.
I have a question on that. That's it. Thank you. One of the questions that I have that could be helpful for us in the future as we look into this is to the left of the 2018 column. It might be helpful to understand what the 2017 tax rate or tax would have been for each of those examples. The reason I ask is I remember when this tax first went into effect, receiving calls and emails about significant increases at that time. And I'm a little bit concerned about basing conclusions on 2018 versus 2019 versus 2021, when we may not, 2018 may not be the right, may not be showing a number that is consistent with prior years. So I guess what I'm saying is, if there was a great big increase 2017 to 2018, that would be important for us to know as we look at the trend across time on this. The other thing that I'm somewhat troubled by is how far back this data has to come from. I can tell you that I would very much doubt, and I think this is on the page just before this, the profitability calculations. And maybe it's one before that. Keep going. Maybe one more. No. Where you're calculating the percentages, please. Maybe not. There you go. The one that shows, what businesses in the different categories is the one I'm referring to. So let me just go ahead and ask my question. Some of them don't make a ton of sense to me. For example, the management firm has a profitability of 110%. That seems a little confusing to me. And I would bet that in this past year, most of those rates have gone down. Profitability rates have gone down significantly. So I'm sure our restaurants are suffering at a higher rate. Their profitability as a percentage is way down. I'm sure our real estate category is probably very far down, as many people are unable to pay for their rent or leases at this time. Now, this is the category where you see 110% at the bottom. So I'm a little bit hesitant to make conclusions on these sets of numbers for a number of reasons, but I'm really struggling with some of these changes and making a determination of which one is right. Is 2019 right, or is 2018 right? And with 2020 being such a terrible year for all businesses, I'm very hesitant to make any tax increase or change in our collection amounts from businesses this year. Thank you.
Councilmember Hall.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Ryan. A very detailed and informative presentation. I'd like to start with the reason that we're here. And what we're here to do is we're here to discuss how we can help champion our Roswell businesses, especially through these tough COVID times. I work with small businesses across the country on a daily basis, and I know the struggles that many of them are facing. How we can do that is by doing something similar to what the federal government and I think the state government has done, something like a Roswell, our version of the Roswell CARES Act. And I hope that there will be majority approval to do something like that to help our specifically struggling businesses. The other thing I'd just like to mention is I have been explaining portions of Brian's presentation to a lot of residents who have been very confused. There's been a lot of information that's been out there in the social media about this topic that maybe isn't, or that actually isn't accurate. But one of the big questions was people are very confused about these tables, and basically what these tables are is their indexes. And they wanted to know, well, why can't we use this table? And why can't we pick another table and use any table? Or this one's more recent, let's use that one. Well, the answer is, if you had drafted, consider our ordinance that was passed in 2016, an apple. Well, you've got an apple, you've got to put an apple in that bucket. You're using your apples, your IRS apple table that you use to structure that ordinance. And so because that was the data from the table that aggregated a certain population of information, you had rates going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to 12. Well, had you used the alternate table that finance grabbed in 19 and 20, when you had structured that to be revenue neutral at that time, your rates perhaps may have been 3, 4, 5, 6, and those would have been the same answer. So that's the difference about mixing apples and oranges. And so what led me to question that $500,000, I just started asking about the $500,000 shortfall because I wanted to know why that occurred, and that led me to discover that we weren't doing apples to apples. We were mixing an orange in there with the apples. And the number basically is $415,000 of a difference in 2019, and potentially that number in 20. But that's a different conversation. That's an operational conversation of checks and balances and systems in place. What we need to talk about is what we're going to do for the Roswell businesses going forward into 2021. And I've got some, ideas to throw out. I'll let other council members comment, but that's what really this is all about.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Hall. I will let other council members comment. Councilmember Judy.
So I'm a bit confused. We started this process out on apartments versus restaurants, looking at that and taxable and how to do that. Then we went to highest profitability businesses. Now we're into a chart and NTIS codes and all these different things. Quite frankly, this is not the time to have this conversation. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Businesses are not thinking about changing tax rates right now. They're thinking about surviving. And to have this conversation right now, yeah, we probably need to have the conversation. Let's have this conversation when the emergency clears. I'm not here tonight to talk about what we can do for businesses. This is about the tax rate tables, because what we can do for businesses shouldn't be talking about raising taxes and then changing their tax tables in the middle of a pandemic. So I say that this conversation should be had post this, looking at this for 2022 and beyond, because we're going to have half of 2021 that's going to be a fiscal year that's going to be changed by this pandemic we're on. And I just don't agree with having this conversation right now at all. I think businesses are hurting a lot. I think this has changed many times from where it started. And now tonight we want to change the conversations again to a CARES Act for businesses in Roswell. Where's that money going to come from? I mean, we're in a deficit already. So I agree. We need to talk about what's happening for businesses, but not during a conversation on changing tax tables in the middle of a pandemic, no matter how high or low the number is. And so I just having this conversation right now is just beyond me. And I think this conversation needs to be put off till next year, till the emergency clears and everybody's thinking with the correct data and a clear head after we have this pandemic in hand. I just, this is just shocking to me.
Councilmember Zapata.
Thank you, Mayor. So I will try to be as clear as possible on my remarks, so everybody will understand. And my head is always clear in the most critical time of my life. Is when I'm fortunate that my head is very clear when it's critical times in my life. So, and this is when we all have to have the clear mind when there's critical times in our lives. So, well, I believe it is crucial to analyze, have a technical discussion, and understand about the error made in the calculation of occupational business license tax during the last 2 years. Unfortunately, recently there have been a campaign of intentional misinformation spread, especially on social media, among the small business community. And this came from a small group of people looking after their own political gain. That being said, let's start with an overview. As an overview, we need to understand that in the city of Roswell, 70% of the tax revenue is coming from homeowners, and only 30% is coming from businesses. In other words, homeowners are picking up 70% of the bill. The problem we have today, let's talk about that, and let me try to be as clear as possible so public understand exactly what's going on. As an occupational business license tax was reduced 2 years ago by error of the Office of the City Administrator, our Chief Operating Officer, generating a tax deficit of potentially approaching maybe close to $1 million. A deficit that was subsidized by homeowners during the last 2 years. But here's the solution.
Councilmember Zapata, I would like to ask you to stick to the facts, please.
Yeah, I'm talking to the facts, so let me continue, please, and don't interrupt me. I appreciate it. So the solution, we just talked about the problem. Everybody understood the problem. Let's talk about the solution. Occupational business license tax was reduced. So the solution now that Councilmember Palermo identified the problem and Councilmember Hall identified the technical error made, we need to correct and fix the error. Be consistent, restore the original correct IRS profitability by industry table that contemplate all business types and bring back fair tax for homeowners and businesses. So to make it more clear, let me just illustrate with an example for you to understand better the current problem and solution. Let's say here that your your local pizza restaurant on Canton Street sells a delicious pizza margarita for $13.50, regular price. But one day, the restaurant administrator made a digit error on the system, and the pizza margarita for the next 2 days shows on the menu at $1.35 instead of $13.50 regular price. On the third day, the shareholder of the restaurant is checking the menu and notice the error, and immediately ask the administrator to correct the error on the menu and start ringing the pizza margarita at $13.50 regular price. So now, let me tell you, I don't believe any reasonable customer who enjoyed the restaurant, the pizza, and the service will ever accuse the shareholder of the restaurant of increasing the price of the pizza margarita. It was just a matter of correcting a mistake. Consider possible temporary relief by offering a CARES package Roswell, CPR. Unfortunately, right now, we all know that residents and some business owners are living extreme, challenging times. In order to truly and honestly help and support some of the businesses who have been directly negatively affected by COVID, I will support some form of care package Roswell CPR relief for 2021 calendar year for the less profitable and most affected businesses during this 2020 pandemic. I will request to our city administrator, Gary Palmer, to come back to mayor and council with some different recommendations on how to really realistic and truly support the most affected businesses in the city of Roswell. Because a $15 to $100 occupational business license tax saving, honestly, and I'm telling you as a business owner, honestly, is not going to determine if the small business is going to survive or not to this pandemic. So if we all really want to help the business, we have to do more than saving 15 to $100. So I would like to know options, realistic options that we can contemplate to truly help those businesses, mainly small businesses, who through this pandemic are suffering more than ever. So this error and apparent lack of oversight and internal controls cannot be repeated again. Roswell homeowners cannot be responsible for subsidizing these kind of crucial errors. So we need to make sure that internal controls on our chief operating officer are in place so this kind of error does not repeat in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Wilsey, I'll get to you in a minute. You had your hand up next. I would like to read this again. Section point 10.3.12a states that the finance department shall review assignment of businesses to profitability classes on a biannual basis and administratively reassign businesses as necessary to the then most accurate profitability class. This is what has been happening. Now, if council would like to change that ordinance, if council would like to direct staff to look at how we can change that ordinance, if council wants to review this on a biannual basis, if council wants to review this on a bi-weekly basis, that is up to us as elected officials, and we need to let staff know that we aren't happy with the way this has been in the recent past. However, when we go down the road of malfeasance or misconduct, I have an issue with that because Mr. Luckett was following our ordinance. Now, if we want to change that, that's our power to do that, and I would strongly suggest that we do that. But I am not going to go down this road of pointing fingers of people on our staff that council members deem unworthy of being a Roswell employee. So number one, please stick to the facts. Number two, We've got a hard stop at 6:45. We've got 3 people waiting to speak. Councilmember Wilsey.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and thank you everyone for your comments and Mr. Luckett for your presentation. Interesting comments. I also wish that this work session had been titled Ways to Help Our Existing Businesses and Attract New Businesses in Times of Uncertainty, but unfortunately it wasn't. It was called to discuss business occupation taxes and how we might adjust them. And in the process, we've caused a lot of unnecessary worry and concern among our small business community. You know, I know that we don't want to be the city that's raising taxes on plumbers and restaurants and anyone that leases space, particularly in this time of uncertainty. So I don't think this is the time to be looking at this. I wish that it had been framed much differently from the beginning, and it would not have caused all the concern and unrest among the community that it has. I also want to just point out that the occupational taxes result in about 1.5 million in taxes to the city. And if we want to take a look at how to reduce the burden on our homeowners, what we really need to be doing is looking at ways to improve the value of our commercial properties. Even during this time of uncertainty, we have just passed some very restrictive, we have some very restrictive zoning restrictions that possibly stand to reduce the value and assessments on these properties. So that's what these conversations should be about, not about raising occupation taxes on the businesses that are doing business in Roswell and trying to make it during this time.
Councilmember Palermo.
Thank you, Mayor Henry. And so, Mr. Luckett, really appreciate the presentation. Always a very thorough job, and definitely hearing your feedback, because I think what I believe I heard you pointing out with your recommendation to move to the other table is for that accuracy and the consistency. And I think what we all need to be really looking at is the right balance, because we have our businesses, we have our homeowners, and I think we do really need to make sure that we're working hard to focus on that right balance, which unfortunately I don't think has been necessarily done as much as it should have been. But I would like to go, one of the other council members had brought up kind of the history behind this. The way this discussion had started at the beginning of the year was, it was said it was because looking at restaurants and apartment complexes, it was actually looking at profitability segments, because you don't have a tax in Roswell on specifically a restaurant tax separate from an apartment tax. It's based on profitability margins, which Mr. Luckett's walked us through. But nonetheless, really a discussion I had, and being familiar with other cities, a concern that perhaps we had too high of a tax rate on our smallest margin businesses, and that we were taxing our highest margin at a much lower rate than other cities. And basically, Mr. Luckett and his team came back with the information and showed that actually for both we're lower. And again, especially with all our many small businesses, our many lower margin businesses, which ultimately make up 95% of our businesses in our city, I think it's really important that we are having a low tax rate and we're helping encourage and support them. And really through this is where I saw, wait a minute, we saw the restaurant taxes, which again was for all of the low margin businesses within that segment. We saw that their tax rate had stayed exactly the same, which was that 0.02%, I'm sorry, 0.0002%. And that stayed flat. But then noticed the highest margin businesses, theirs had that massive tax cut, going from 0.0012% down to 0.0006%. And that's where that seemed a little strange and a little confusing on why did that group get such a large tax change and decrease, when businesses that are struggling like restaurants and so many other small businesses did not. And so now we've learned from Mr. Luckett, and appreciate again just that detailed presentation. The reason is because it was a different table that was being pointed to, which didn't help the restaurants and a number of other small margin businesses, but certainly really very largely helped the highest margin businesses. And then ultimately what that also led to is the majority of this council earlier this year voted for really an increase in taxes and for homeowners. That's just a fact. It's Georgia law. So I see somebody shaking their head. But again, our assessments went up and we didn't lower the millage rate. So there was a tax increase, which means the homeowners were paying for this mistake or this issue. So for me, all along, I still stand by what I've said from the very beginning. I do not and I will not support increasing taxes on our small businesses, on our so many really struggling businesses at this time. And I think at the same time, we do need to make sure that we're looking at the right balance. And again, seeing a concern where there's such a discrepancy with, for example, our highest margin on where it is with other cities. And I think we need to do this right. We need to do it carefully. And I would love to be able to find some teamwork and consensus instead of just the political jabs, because again, all the complete misinformation that was spread on social media and through different discussions is not good for our community. It's not good for our small businesses. It's not good for anyone here. We instead need to really work with accurate facts and see what are the different choices to move forward. And I think I agree with something Mayor Henry said earlier. I actually think it is important we get to the right table, which based on staff's recommendation on what staff said they saw as really the accurate table for that accurate comparison. And at the same time, I'd like to see it in a way where it is revenue neutral. Again, I do not want to see our small businesses, especially now, having an increase in taxes. But I think we do need to make sure we're on the right table. And I want to applaud something that Councilmember Hall said. I saw there were some attacks and some jabs to Councilmember Hall for bringing it up. But if not now, then when? We need to be talking about what can we actually do to be helping our small businesses. Because I think, yes, you're right. The main focus of this conversation is really the change in non-apples to apples comparison that really benefited the highest margin businesses, did not benefit really the small businesses. We need to address that. But again, in doing it in a way that's done carefully, we need to really be having it, I think, together, a conversation of how do we actually help our small businesses? And Councilmember Hall had an example. I think it sounded like Councilmember Zapata wanted to look at it. What I'd like to bring up is even, for example, some due dates coming up. I talked to some small businesses that were worried and had believed the false claims that there was a current proposal to raise taxes on small businesses. They were very relieved to hear that was completely inaccurate. But also, they were bringing it up because I was asking them what are ways that the city can help. And it was even just brought up that there's a bill coming up soon. I don't know if it was for excise tax to the city or what it was, but maybe even having some type of delay, having the ability to pay in pieces. Why aren't we discussing that? That's what we should be discussing. So again, I appreciate staff and Mr. Luckett's and his entire team coming up with this really explanation of kind of why we saw such a decrease and such a change in benefit to just certain high margin industries. So thank you for that. That's important. And let's address that, but let's do it in a way that we're also at the same time helping our small businesses, because it was brought up, where are we going to get the money to help our small businesses? There's already a deficit. Well, I'm telling you right now, if we're not helping our small businesses, that's just going to add to the deficit. So I think that's what we focus on. It's not, I'm sorry, I was very disappointed to hear council members say, well, we should just increase the value of commercial properties, and the fact that we had zoning restrictions changes that. The zoning restrictions were only specifically on these large apartment buildings. It was only on apartments. There were no other restrictions that were added. It was just purely the fact we've been seeing too many properties turn into just such oceans of apartments and multifamily. And that, I feel like that's not a productive part of this discussion. Let's get back to how we're helping the small businesses and helping our city move forward.
Thank you. Councilmember Tizer, you had your hand up next. However, I would like to interject something. One of the things that has been very frustrating to me is this narrative has been changing not only on a daily basis, but an hourly basis. And I don't know what we're talking about anymore. So now we're completely off topic with a new item. We started off raising apartment taxes, lowering restaurant taxes, and that has morphed. Then it was the issue of raising business taxes. Now, and thank you, Councilmember Hall, for bringing forward what you found in diving into this issue, because that creates another new narrative on this. Now, tonight, we're talking about a CARES Act funding from the city of Roswell. So like I said, my head is spinning because I don't know where the narrative is at any given point in time. What I would suggest we do is, and I'll get to you, Councilmember Tizer, is that we give staff guidance on whether or not we want to change this occupation tax table. My personal preference would be if we give them that guidance that it needs to remain revenue neutral. Then my third thing that I would like to see is that we have a 5-year plan after we come out of this global pandemic. So I think that we've got a lot on our plate, but throwing all of this stuff in, you're making vegetable soup. And honestly, I don't know which vegetable is floating to the top. So if we could get some clarity. We've got about 10 minutes to a hard stop. Let me just interject this. We've got 2 people that would like to speak this evening. If we don't make it to those 2 people, I will make sure that their comments that they had written online would be a part of the public record. And then, of course, if you all want to go and or go to another work session or a different narrative on what we're looking at this given point in time, I'd appreciate that direction. Councilmember Tizer.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to just clear up a couple of things. There's been a lot of apples, oranges, and fruits and vegetables mentioned in this discussion. I've heard from a number of people in the last few days about the 70% that our residents pay and the 30% that our businesses pay. I'd just like to make that very clear. That's property tax. That has nothing to do with occupation tax. And so if you want to fix that, we don't need to tax businesses more. We need more businesses to tax. Let me say it again. We don't need more tax. We don't need to tax businesses more. We need more businesses to tax. The other thing I've heard that's been very, very confusing to people is this narrative that we raised their property tax. So let me just say 2 things on that, just to make sure everyone understands. There is no increase in property tax. There is an error in the state's formula. When corrected, we will likely have a deficit, not an increase. And it's misleading to say otherwise. Here's why. If you take last year into account and you looked at our rollback rate, we would have been between $600,000 and $750,000 in deficit. And why? Because the state's formula has left out appeals. That's the reduced value from our preliminary digest to our final digest. And that's a fact. So you can frown all you want. That's just a fact. So this year, when we're done with appeals, I'm fairly certain that $100,000 difference will go away. But we would have been in close to a $750,000 deficit in our property tax had that happened. So those are 2 separate things. I'd also like to just share with you that you know, it's not our money, and we need to be very careful what and how we tax things. And so I agree with what the mayor said. We need to spend some time thinking through what we want to do, how we want to do it, and how to keep it as revenue neutral as we can. But mixing all these taxes around just to confuse people, I think is not productive. And having good, solid discussions about things, that would be productive.
Councilmember Wilsey, you had your hand up next.
Yes, and thank you, Mayor. And I just want to reiterate that I think the conversations we need to be having are how to improve the value and the success of our businesses and attract new businesses. And I just think somehow that was brought up, and I think that was a challenge that we laid on the table, is how do we help businesses during this time of uncertainty. During that June 9th work session, when this business occupation tax was first brought up, but somehow this is what has ended up as a continued discussion. I just would like to see us change course, and to everyone's point, just be positive about how we can improve our city and not continue these discussions that go down rabbit holes and never really accomplish anything that any of us want to see.
Councilmember Zapata.
You're mute.
Thank you. So I heard that I was accused of pointing fingers. And what I want to make clear is what I call accountability and responsibility. Some other people might call it pointing fingers. I was taught that this is called accountability and responsibility. Neither homeowners nor businesses are responsible or accountable for the error made to calculate occupational business license tax. But unfortunately, homeowners not knowing have to pay and subsidize the error for the last 2 years. That being said, Roswell residents, business owners, and mayor and council deserve to have a clear explanation on how the office of the city administrator, our chief operating officer, overlooked the reduction of occupational business license tax during the last 2 years without a formal presentation and a discussion on a public
I
forum.
allow you to continue along this line. You
Overlooked.
are out of order. Number one, we are not discussing personnel issues in this public meeting. Number two, there was nothing that was done wrong. How many times do I need to read this ordinance to you? It was followed the way council wrote the ordinance and implemented it. So please don't go down this road with me, because there was no error. They followed what they were supposed to be doing. Now, is it the right way to do it? Perhaps not, but that's on us. We are at the top of the food chain. We write policy, and if we want this policy taken in a different direction, we need to make that happen. Councilmember Judy.
Thank you, Mayor. To your point, I have no idea what we're talking about now. We have been down every rabbit hole with this tax, that tax, what's going on here. And now we're going after staff as usual. This is not where we need to be as a city council. And for me, I'd like to clear up another thing is I've talked to many businesses as well. And many businesses are confused and many businesses aren't happy, even with what is there, and they were not relieved. And I've heard a lot from a lot of different businesses in this community that we are not business friendly as Roswell. And this does nothing to endear us to businesses that want to come to our city when in papers, et cetera, on the internet, it's going to say Roswell considers raising taxes in the middle of a pandemic. So when you're looking at marketing your city, it's not the right thing to do. It's not the right time. And like I said before, this could be a productive conversation if defined and taken it the right way, rather than 50 million things being thrown out and everybody being confused about what we're trying to do. And that's what's happened. The double speak, the political double speak in this is amazing to me, because we go down one rabbit hole, and when people have opposition to that, we're just going to change the narrative to it. So let's just say what it really is. This is raising taxes on business. And so what we need to do is figure out whether we want to do that in a pandemic or not. For me, I don't want to do it in a pandemic. After the pandemic, when things cleared, then I think we can look at the tables. But right now, this is not necessary.
Councilmember Palermo, I'm going to call on you, but I would also like to point out that we've got 3 minutes to a hard stop. I would like for Councilmember Hall to have the ability to make some final comments. She brought this forward to me and requested that we have this work session, and I think it's only fair that we close with her comments. The other thing, Councilmember Hall, as Councilmember Palermo speaking, if you have any recommendations on how you think we should move forward with staff, and we can give consensus to that if we agree, to get us to the next conversation. But once again, I'd like to just have one conversation. I'm not saying only one time we have a conversation, but one conversation. we're not going to have 15 conversations in one meeting and none of us know where we're going with it. So Councilmember Palermo.
Thank you, Mayor Henry. So again, I want to stress, so Mr. Luckett, who I think does a phenomenal job and really should be an example, I feel, to so many more here at City Hall. He brought up, so obviously it was his group. They followed the law and they changed. They used a different table. He could have today got up and said, oh, you know what? It should just continue to be changed. He, in his recommendation, said that his recommendation would be to change to the other table and stick with that other table going forward. And I think that shows accountability, but also I think it's a good recommendation. And because, to the mayor's point, we can move to the right table and do it from a tax revenue neutral standpoint. So just because we switch to the right table doesn't mean we have to increase taxes. But I really do think that there's issues here, because I'm hearing that, just the concern with raising taxes when we're not looking at the whole picture. Because again, we heard another council member, they feel there's an error in the way the state calculates it. I feel it's a philosophical thing. I feel actually you should not be able to count your appeals. Your goal should be to keep your spending low and not just rely and hope for future appeals. But here's really spells out in his presentation on 13, the fact that we have holding companies, for example, compared to restaurants. And so they have over 10 times, or really over 12 times a higher profitability margin. But then the way the tax is currently set up, they're only paying, I think, either half or a third of the rate that the holding companies are. So it really just shows, our tax code, and partly based on the mistake of going to that other table.
Member Palermo, I would like
to benefit
all to have a final word on this meeting. We've got a hard stop, and we will not be able to listen to the two people that are online to give their comments. And I hate that, but like I said, we will publish those written comments with our minutes. Councilmember Hall, closing comment.
Thank you, Mayor Henry, and thank you, everybody, for your comments. First of all, again, thank you, Brian, for the presentation. As far as I'd like to address, I believe that we have a fiduciary responsibility to not continue to use an incorrect table that's not tied with our tax code, and to, as Mr. Luckett suggested, go to the correct table. There's opportunities to do a Roswell CARES Act that may not necessarily, or don't necessarily have to impact financially other taxpayers, but we can do things like, we can look at the 2020 numbers in arrears to base the 2021 occupational tax on. Those numbers will be lower, and that is something that Director Luckett had suggested previously, and we can do that going forward. We can also break the payment into 2 installments, the first one being in March, the one in September. We can also do something like the Treasury and the SBA have done in the PPP and the CARES Act, where we can look at the businesses that are struggling and perhaps, eliminate a fee for them or something like that. There's a lot of opportunities to help businesses. So that's what this is all about, helping businesses, doing our fiduciary responsibility, using the correct tables, and making it as revenue neutral as possible for those struggling businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Hall. And I do agree that CARES Act funding could play a role in this. However, I would also like to caution everyone that we haven't even had our first budget quarterly review yet. So all of these decisions cannot be made in a vacuum or on the fly at a work session. So I personally would support our staff's recommendation that we switch tables, but only if it's revenue neutral. And so I don't know if anybody has an inclination to have staff work on that, or if you would like this just to go back to another, or I should say a committee meeting and then to a council meeting. I would support having staff look at changing the table, revenue neutral, and a 5-year plan on how to deal with that. So is there support on that? I'm seeing a couple heads nod.
Yes.
So, but there's nothing definitive. So we're giving staff a split message. So why don't we go ahead and do this? I'll speak with each one of you individually, and we'll try to come up with a direction to give staff. And we'll do a report on it. The next committee meeting is tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. But I think that maybe the appropriate admin finance committee meeting, is that tomorrow?
No.
Huh?
No.
No. So that in 2 weeks, we've got an admin finance committee meeting. And like I said, I would highly suggest that we follow staff's recommendation, but revenue neutral and a 5-year plan, so we don't deal with this again. And then also the other thing too that we've got to strongly consider, because staff has been following the ordinance on whether or not we want to make an ordinance change. So that's another conversation we need to have. So I would encourage you all to think about that. And I appreciate your time and your thoughts this evening, and we are adjourned.